And maybe just to give you a couple of examples, it focuses on, for instance, better enforcement of the EU legal framework in the area, specifically also the Racial Equality Directive, improving policing through training and sharing of best practices to prevent discrimination and racial profiling, improving education by awareness-raising seminars on racial and ethnic stereotypes, as well as mainstreaming inclusion in education policies. There's also a focus on increased EU funding to promote diversity in the labor market, in housing and in healthcare, as well as to counter extremism and hate speech through the sharing of best practices. There's also a bigger focus now on equality data collection and on increasing the diversity in the European Commission itself. So another thing that I would mention when it comes to the action plan, I think, is important to also underline that it acknowledges cities' experience to develop strategies to combat racism. And it also explicitly mentions Eurocities as a good example of city cooperation on such issues. So all of this to say, there is a momentum to work on this topic now, also with a view to policymaking. And I think that city dialogues such as ours are a really good way to connect and also to think about how to raise visibility of city actions on anti-racism and equal opportunities. Now, Julie has already mentioned how a range of cities are tackling racism on different fronts. And today we will be hearing more on that, especially also from Glasgow, as they're working in all of these areas pretty much. They have a task force for BME communities. They also work on integrating new Scots in the communities that they live in. And of course, they have initiatives on colonialism and slavery legacies and active anti-racist work in culture and the urban agenda, and I'm sure much more as well. So I'm happy now to hand over to Councillor David MacDonald, who is the Deputy Leader of the Glasgow City Council and the City Convener for Culture, Vibrancy and International Cooperation, who will moderate today's City Dialogue. And Councillor MacDonald is joined by the Social Affairs Vice Chair, Annette Christie, who heads the city's task force. And he's also joined by Councillor Graham Campbell, who is the chair of Glasgow's Working Group on Imperialism and Slavery Legacy. So Councillor MacDonald, I give you the floor.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Katerina, and to colleagues from Eurocities for all of your hard work in helping establish today's City Dialogue. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to virtually welcome colleagues to Glasgow. And the great thing about visiting Glasgow virtually is that it never rains. So you don't need your umbrella for this meeting, which is unusual for any meeting that takes place in Glasgow. But we are very pleased to have this opportunity to host this City Dialogue today. And while I've spoken at a number of Eurocities events in the past, this is the first one where I've had the chance to be the moderator, and it's sometimes very dangerous to give a politician control over a meeting, but I understand that this is a dialogue and it's not for me to talk endlessly, so my goal today will be to ensure that we hear as many voices as possible on this hugely important topic. I think it's very fitting that we've been able to bring so many colleagues from different Eurocities forums together. Many members here from the Culture Forum and from the Social Affairs Forum, and I think that's very relevant because we know that it's only through collective action and by working together that we'll be able to truly tackle the issues of racism within our society. And I'm very pleased to have my own city government colleagues here, and I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to hear from them later in today's discussions. I wanted to very quickly speak a little bit about Glasgow, about where we came from and where we are going as a city. We view Glasgow very much as a city of both immigration and migration, and we know that Scots left Glasgow in great numbers and they travelled across the world and they settled in new communities across the globe, and that has given Glasgow a real sense of internationalism that we are welcoming generally as a people, because we know that our own ancestors have travelled around the world and haven't always had the most welcoming receptions. The stories, though, that we tell ourselves are very important, and the narrative that exists in our city is important, and we want to maybe challenge some of the myths that exist around that notion of welcome and what it means to be a Glaswegian abroad, what it means to be a new Scot today living in Scotland. And we have a real role to play in tackling some of those myths that exist. And that's something that we've been doing for a long time in Glasgow, probably for about 50 years, of trying to uncover some of the city's history and its links from the time when it was the second city of the British Empire. And at the time, that was an uncontested boast that people would make about how powerful and great that made Glasgow as a city, without really getting under the surface of what a statement like that means and what the human cost of empire, of colonialism, actually is. And it was through the work of one of our most loved city museums called the People's Palace that we really started to unearth Glasgow's links with slavery. This was a piece of work that was started in 1975 in Glasgow, which was the year that Glasgow celebrated its 800th anniversary as a city. And it was perhaps the first time in many of those centuries that this conversation was taking place about Glasgow's role internationally and the human cost of imperialism truly had within Glasgow. And it unearthed an awakening in the city that meant that people wanted to take action. They wanted to show a level of international solidarity, and that probably culminated with the awarding to Nelson Mandela of the freedom of the city of Glasgow. Glasgow was the first city in the world to give Mandela freedom of the city while he was still in prison in South Africa. And we even renamed a street. The street that was the home of the South African embassy in Glasgow was renamed as Nelson Mandela Place. So these actions that are very contemporary around the world at the moment have been part of Glasgow's story since at least the 1970s. But unfortunately, in the 1980s and the 1990s, some of that history was forgotten again, and the city began a major regeneration program of an area within the city centre, which it gave the new corporate name of the Merchant City, forgetting entirely that the merchants that they were celebrating were the same merchants who were benefiting from slavery and who became known as the tobacco lords when Glasgow was the global centre for the tobacco trade. The Glasgow story, though, again was given new light was shone upon that story during 2014 when Glasgow hosted the Commonwealth Games, and it really was a robust re-examination of Glasgow's links to empire. During that sporting games, we also held a cultural festival programme called Festival 2014, and it embraced a curation of events from cafes, where a World Cafe model where the discussion of slavery took place on the same streets that those merchants walked, and creative and dramatic performances such as the Emancipation Acts, which the advertisement for this event featured a still image from. As we go through today, you'll hear shortly from my colleague Graham Campbell, who was one of the key community activists involved in those events in 2014. And it was at that point he started to ask a very important question of people as a way to start engaging them in understanding Glasgow and Scotland's history. And this might be a question that some of you will know the answer to. And if you do, please maybe put the answer into the chat box at the moment. If you had to guess which country, which Commonwealth country around the world do you think has the largest amount of Scottish surnames? So outside of Scotland. So names like mine, like MacDonald, a very Scottish surname. Which of the Commonwealth nations would you imagine to have the biggest percentage of people with those Scottish surnames? If you think you might know the answer, then please do pop it in the chat box. If you don't have the answer, I'll be glad to tell you that that country is Jamaica. And that might not have been people's first guesses, because people normally think Canada or New Zealand, where Scots emigrated in huge numbers. But you'll maybe find out later when you hear from Graham why Jamaica is the #1 city. Since our election as a city government in 2017, we've really been prioritising the work to eliminate racism within our city, to tackle issues around racial inequality, and that has been one of our key political priorities. We've launched our task force that is chaired by Annette Christie, who's also the vice chair of the Eurocities Social Affairs Forum, and Councillor Graham Campbell is the chair of our brand new working group on slavery and the legacy of imperialism. But we also hope that this city dialogue will play an important part in the work that we're doing in Glasgow, and will help us to shape our own response to Black Lives Matter and to all of the social issues that exist within our city. So I want to now hand over to Graham Campbell, which I'm going to do via a video, and he is going to set the scene more and give you a bit more of a insight into Glasgow's links and our Black history in Glasgow. So hopefully we can play that video now.
Aruni, you're on mute.
Caribbean councillor. Glasgow is a city in Scotland where 600,000 people live, and it's known for music, culture, and of course, very warm and friendly people. But like a lot of cities in the UK, Glasgow has a darker side to its history. Glasgow was heavily involved in slavery. Glasgow's involvement was mainly focused on owning slaves, making money from the plantations, and the sale of goods made by enslaved people, rather than slave trading directly. Everywhere you turn in Glasgow, you see the names of wealthy men who are remembered for their roles in engineering, charity, the arts, politics, but their connections to slavery have all but been forgotten. The money generated by enslaved people allowed Glasgow's industries to grow and beautiful architecture to be built, which is still standing today. Black people are central to the story of our cities because their work helped to shape the buildings, culture, and history. Here's a statue of James Watt. He's an 18th century inventor who modernized the steam engine. But there's a difficult part of his past which people don't really like to talk about. Watt's father was a slave trader and made money through the trade in slave-produced goods such as sugar, rum, and cotton. James and his brother John also bought enslaved people to sell in Scotland. James was so successful that he was on the back of a £50 note, and Glasgow University even named a building after him, but they got a lot of criticism for doing that. James Watt is a complicated figure because in later years he went on to reject slavery, but his son went on to sell steam-powered equipment to plantations in the Caribbean, and so the family benefited from the system, but in a different way. This is the area called Merchant City. Several streets in this area are named after 18th century tobacco lords, who were a group of Scottish merchants who made fortunes trading in tobacco produced by enslaved people in the Americas and in the West Indies. I'm on Glassford Street, named after tobacco lord and slave owner John Glassford. The Glassfords owned many properties, including what was the Shorefield Mansion here in the city centre. There's a family portrait showing John Glassford and his family at the mansion. If you look closely, you can see the faint outline of an enslaved black boy that the family would have brought back to Scotland with them. I'm now outside Glasgow's Gallery of Modern Art, and as you can see, it's a pretty impressive building. But the man who built it has a not so impressive backstory. This was once the grand home of William Cunningham, who was a powerful tobacco lord who made a lot of money from the labor of enslaved people in America and the Caribbean. This iconic building was funded with money earned from the work of enslaved people on tobacco plantations.
So I think you can hopefully from that video understand why the issues of addressing our Black history in Glasgow are so important. And in order for us to do that, we have set out on a new approach to challenge some of the stories that we tell ourselves and some of the actions that we have traditionally taken as a city. So I want to introduce you to our next speaker, who is a member of staff from Glasgow Life. Glasgow Life, for those of you who may not be familiar, is the UK's largest cultural organisation, and it runs all of Glasgow's civic museums, all of our festivals, all of our events and sports facilities across the city. But more and more, it has a role in ensuring that the city is being truly representative of all of our communities. And I'm really pleased to be able to introduce to you our senior manager within Glasgow Life, who has responsibility for being our agent of change and in helping us to tackle some of the issues that we have about racism within the city. So I'm happy now to hand over to Naomi Shoba.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming along. So the previous speakers and video have done a great job on historical context. So Irene, I'm going to get you to maybe go ahead 2 slides within my presentation, because they've done a brilliant job kind of setting up that historical context. So if you could go ahead 1 slide and 1 more. 1 more, and then the next one. So we've had that historical context. Oh, next slide, please, Irene. So we know that white Europeans created a false racial hierarchy to justify the kidnapping, torture, murder, and chattel enslavement of West African families. And that's the basis of systemic and structural racism that we're living with today. So that's a good historical framing for the work Glasgow's doing. So I'm based in Glasgow Life, and as David said, Glasgow Life is our city's largest culture and leisure provider, and it's part of the council family. So we work really closely with Glasgow City Council, and we've got a series of services which span museums, arts and music, libraries, communities, sports, and we serve the entirety of Glasgow and Glasgow's visitors and tourists. So Glasgow is the most diverse city in Scotland, and in the 2011 census, the non-UK born population was 12%, so that's only grown now. There's a large Pakistani and Indian diaspora, and diaspora from multiple different African countries. And of course, like most big European cities, we have families and communities of colour who've been here for hundreds of years. Next slide, please. So I'm an agent for change within Glasgow Life, and it's a joint role between Glasgow Life and Creative Scotland, who are one of the cultural branches of the Scottish Government. And I'm acting as an agent for change, which is a facilitator, a manager, a critical friend to lead some substantive change in the organisation. I'm based in the Arts Service, and my focus is on race and ethnicity. So I work with the arts producers, the programmers, arts officers in the development and improvement of our artistic portfolio, which I'm going to talk a bit about later on in the presentation. So there's an Agent for Change here in Glasgow, and there's one in Edinburgh City Council, because Creative Scotland has considered it a really successful model that they've wanted to replicate. Next slide, please. So we've already started to talk about anti-racism. So I wanted to offer this quote from Ejima Olu, which says, "The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward." So Glasgow Life has defined anti-racism as about equity and justice. It's about understanding white supremacy and actively challenging it, changing the structures and the systems that create the inequalities. So how do we take those values and put them into practice? Next slide, please. So I wanted to frame what I'm going to talk about in terms of the everyday practice and embedding anti-racism in our work with a quote from Kyle Guante Tranmaya, who's an American activist. And he says, "Remember, white supremacy is not a shark, it is the water." Because we are trying to challenge a complex, almost invisible 400-year-old system based on privilege and disadvantage, based on the colour of your skin. So to navigate that, we need a really clear toolkit. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we start. We start with the agreement to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. We need courage to speak our own truths, because we can't speak on behalf of anyone else, and the courage to make mistakes and fail and hold ourselves accountable. We have to interact with our colleagues, with artists, with practitioners, with our audiences and stakeholders. And we can do that in a transformational way or a transactional way. So Glasgow Life is a hierarchical organisation. We're grade-based. And this role, when people were designing it, they made it quite senior. And the reason for that is because ideally we'd go on this transformational value-based journey. However, we need the toolkit to be able to say, come on this journey with us, or to do that in a transactional way, which is, this is what the organisation is committed to, and we expect our employees to reflect that in their work. So both those tools are at my disposal. Targets, goal setting, so we can meet our objectives, training, because different people are at different stages at their journey, and we have to talk about this because this is historical as well as contemporary, and there's lots been deliberately left out of our education system and our civic education, so we're actually filling in a lot of gaps before we even begin the practical application of embedding anti-racism. So training's a must. Time. Now, time is absolutely essential because we're working against a system that's nearly 500 years old now. So the idea that anti-racism could be fast work or temporary work is disrespectful to all the people who've been harmed by racism and ridiculous in terms of the practical application of change. We have to look at white identity. So within Glasgow Life, we are a vastly white majority organisation. So we have to understand what that means, because white isn't one of the races that's been discussed in the same way the others are. White racial identity is quite a new field of study and understanding. So we have to understand how we view everything through a racial lens, and that includes the decisions we make in our professional lives and how we practice. So we've got to get into understanding how being a majority white organisation impacts the work we do and how we do it. We've got to take care of each other because it's not comfortable and it's not easy. So we have to take care of each other in that discomfort, and we have to be really explicit about that because of the amount of harm that racism has done. We have to know that different people are affected in different ways by anti-racist work and make sure we take care of all of us. And that includes care and accountability. So because we're cultural practitioners, we're using things like grants and commissions, and these are opportunities to really prioritise people who are underrepresented in the sector already. We can extend our curatorial reach beyond the Western canon and look for those really exciting practicing artists internationally and nationally. We're using casting and contracts to embed anti-racism. One of the successes of this role has been our, you'll know the British are famous for our pantomimes. So we have a community touring pantomime each year. And since I've been in post, our casting is now 50% white Scottish, 50% people of colour. And that is about the bigger aim of sustaining talent, of making sure Glasgow is a city that's sustainable, relevant and exciting for cultural practitioners to work in and live in. So we're not hemorrhaging talent to Birmingham or Manchester or London. We make anti-racism a standing agenda item. So that's on production meetings as well as staff team meetings. And that really feeds into accountability, because internally we're holding ourselves to account through those regular check-ins and making sure that it's a team responsibility, not just one person or one team's. And externally we're holding ourselves to account by pledging to update our stakeholders through our social media, our websites, our newsletters. So I'm going to start by talking about some specific ways we've embedded anti-racism in Glasgow Life activities. So could I get the next slide, please? Thank you. So I just wanted to put this up because this is just a few of the different resources we've been using recently, of which there are many. But I just thought I'd put that up because it's quite an interesting one to have a little look at. And if anyone's interested in talking more or me sending some resources out, I'm very happy to do that through the Eurocities team. Next slide, please. So here we have Glasgow International Festival of Contemporary Visual Art, which is one of our flagship biennial festivals. So how this meets our anti-racist objectives is because, as you'll know, the visual arts community are really politicised. They're completely alive to social justice and the way society moves. And so we need to meet our audience and stakeholders' expectations that we are responding to current events. So this summer, the team and I published our anti-racist statement, which commits to properly interrogating Glasgow International's role in perpetuating structural racism and white supremacy. So key actions from there include the future recruitment and the whiteness of the staff team and advisory board, research, training, education, and anti-racist curatorial practice, further opportunities for Black practitioners, and considering our environmental actions as part of decolonial practice. Next slide, please. So here we have Glasgow Mela. Mela is a Sanskrit word which means to meet, and it's a coming together of lots of different people to celebrate South Asian culture. It was initiated in 1990 as part of Glasgow's celebrations as the European City of Culture. And this Mela is now one of the biggest Melas in the country. So through our anti-racism work, we've made explicit commitment to Boundary Mela as a platform for South Asian diaspora arts, because we were challenging pressure to make Mela a platform for all diaspora arts, and that was pressure internally and externally. And this boundarying has allowed the diversity within one diaspora to really flourish creatively. And it also means that artists of colour are not competing for scarce resources. Next slide, please. So here we have the Merchant City Festival, which is an outdoor arts festival. And this is really centred on how anti-racism, culture and heritage meet each other. So as you'll have seen from Councillor Graham Campbell's video, the Merchant City is a highly contested area of the city, and this is where the festival takes place. So the festival team has committed to embedding anti-racist practice in the festival, acknowledging the history of the area, because they know it symbolises the city's role in becoming rich from the British Empire trading African families. So in 2019, the festival established a bursary for an artist of colour, 2 residencies prioritising artists of colour, and our programming in 2021 was meant to be this year, but it will be 2021, will feature leading artists of colour commissioned to address the city's history and legacy artistically. Next slide, please. So here we have Tramway, and Tramway is Glasgow's largest contemporary art venue, and it's got seasonal dance, performance art, visual art programming, and with Tramway we use targets. So through the use of targets and training, we've enabled 90% of the programming this year and next year to be from Black artists and artists of colour. And I'm currently delivering quite extensive anti-racism training sessions with the janitorial staff, box office, the technical staff, and the arts producing teams. And so for all of these activities, like I've said, we are holding ourselves internally accountable through my role, through anti-racism being a standing agenda item, and through our commitments to publish our actions on our websites, our social media, our newsletters. So we're also holding ourselves externally accountable and bringing our stakeholders with us on that journey. And I think it's important to discuss that all these events, all these festivals are led by nearly all white majority teams with the exception of Mella. So that means we're not currently adequately providing for our city culturally, but our long-term ambition is to reflect our city and provide really exciting, relevant cultural content for Glasgow, her people and everyone who visits us, whilst making Glasgow a really sustainable, nourishing, enriching place for cultural practitioners to live. Next slide, please. So that's just a little bit about what we're doing in Glasgow and kind of what was at the heart of us hosting a Eurocities forum was to kind of learn, to share insights, to understand a bit of the kind of cross-European practice that's happening. So I wanted to pose a couple of questions for our discussion towards the end of our time together, which is what approaches have your cities taken to anti-racist cultural practice and what has worked well for you and why? Next slide, please. So that just leaves me to say thank you so much for your time. I'm going to hand back to David now. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Naomi. And I think people will be able to see just how in-depth and detailed the work that you're doing is in ensuring that all of our cultural programming in Glasgow is relevant to the audience in the city today, as well as helping us to address some of those historic challenges that we've already touched upon. But we should also point out that the work that Naomi is leading on is also supplemented by work happening across the city. So just one example of that work is the academic work that has been undertaken to forensically examine all of the city's history and the links and the benefits that the city accrued as a result of its links to the transatlantic slave trade. Dr. Stephen Mullen from Glasgow University is renowned as an academic in this field, and he is leading that process to help us understand in Glasgow what the civic infrastructure that we have today in the city, how it was funded or supported by those slave traders, and what the human misery and the cost was of our great Victorian architecture that we have today. And that is helping us to address some of the challenges that we're seeing across Europe, from Bristol to Belgium. We've seen people's sense of frustration about the lack of action on some of that civic infrastructure, leading to statues being toppled. And I think in Glasgow, we have attempted to ensure that our engagement on these sorts of issues are as inclusive as possible, and that we're able to help to tell the fullest possible aspect of our city's story, and that the people of Glasgow will be the ones who shape what happens next to those statues and to those street names going forward. And I think that that will be one of the interesting areas for debate and discussion, and for learning and sharing experiences across all of our European cities. So You have heard a lot about Glasgow so far, but we're now going to travel about 2,000 miles south to Portugal and to Lisbon, and we're really pleased to be partnering with Lisbon to bring you this dialogue today. So it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome Joana Gomes Cardoso, who is the president of the EGEAC, which is a Lisbon municipal company for the management of cultural venues in Lisbon. So Joana, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Thank you, Eurocities and Glasgow City for having me. It's really a privilege to be able to be here and to hear everything that is happening, which is happening here also. And I'll try to, if I can have the PowerPoint presentation up, I'll take you through a few things that are happening. But I think so far what has struck me the most, listening to Naomi's presentation and the video beforehand, is that when you sort of started as a city thinking about all this, and as you mentioned, David, in the 70s, we were still in a dictatorship that lasted until 1974 in Portugal, and that was very much based, one of its central ideas and imagery was, in fact, the idea of the empire. So our starting point, let's say, is very different. And if I can go on to the next slide, for the past 500 years, and as I said, especially during this dictatorship that lasted for most of the 20th century, the Portuguese have really been fed a narrative about being brave discoverers, and I use the word in quotes, of course, of half of the world. And you have to understand this empire in formal political terms lasted until 1975. So my generation, my parents' generation, we are the children of the lost empire, so to speak. And so in a way, even after we became a democracy and until very recently, this narrative of, being proud of this past that brought so much glory to the country is incredibly still very much the dominant narrative. And, aspects such as colonialism, slavery, Inquisition, these are details, so to speak, even in history books, in current history books of school children. And Lisbon in particular, which is indeed probably one of the most diverse, ethnically speaking cities of Europe, because of course of this 500-year-old very rich history, has also in a way tried to ride the wave of the first global city, the first global and tolerant city. This is the narrative we are still being fed. And I chose this painting, which you can see perhaps on the right corner. There is what appears to be a black nobleman on a horse. I'm not sure if you can quite see it on the screen. And that would be, this painting is often used as a proof. I believe it's a Dutch painting of the 16th century, and it's often used as a sort of a proof that Lisbon was this global and tolerant city. If I can move on to the next slide. So our city is full of monuments, perhaps this one, which EGEAC, by the way, which the company I work for and run, is sounded like Glasgow Live. So we run the cultural theatres, museums, monuments of the city, as well as the street cultural activities. So we run the Padrão dos Descobrimentos, the monument to the discoveries. This is a very, very problematic monument in the sense that it all the figures you see there are what we tend to call the discoverers. So the brave men, white men who went out and discovered and created the Portuguese Empire. And this monument was created in 1940 while the Portuguese then dictatorship was hosting a world exhibition, one of these fair world exhibitions that in fact intended to show the strength of the Portuguese Empire. And you still had in 1940 in this very place people put in cages showing how the natives lived type of narrative. And again, this is 1940, not beginning of the 20th century. So this is one of those monuments that was built for that World Exhibition, and it was going to be temporary, but people liked it so much that it stayed, and it's now probably one of the most visited monuments of the city of Lisbon, even though it has this very problematic history. So one of the things we have been doing, and it's been quite a recent movement, it only perhaps as early as the past 5-7 years, is using it. And if I can have the next slide, we have been using it. Oh, sorry, if you can go on. Oh yes, there is an important point there. If I can go back actually one slide. This legal limitations regarding data. That's something that I wanted to point out because it limits us in many ways. And I suspect it's very different from what is happening, at least in the UK, because in Portugal, the Portuguese constitution, which is inspired in the French and German one, does not allow us to have any or to collect any data on the basis of ethnicity. That means we do not know, we empirically know that Lisbon has a very strong and diverse presence of several communities, but we do not know the percentage of those communities, for instance. And this is especially problematic when we start talking about making institutions diverse, because again, besides from an empirical point of view, we have no way of knowing, and we cannot ask. It is seen as racist to ask about someone's origin or ethnicity. So I'll come back to that, but that's a key point which I think distinguishes us and probably makes our life more difficult when we are talking about anti-racist policies. So indeed, continuing the presentation to the next slide, what we have been trying to do is countering that narrative and using those monuments rather than toppling them down. And I'm aware of this, what this expression may mean in the current context, when we do indeed see, and here too, and even with this monument, there have been some calls, although very few, to basically eradicate it. What we have been trying to do is use it to draw attention to those parts of the narrative that are still very seldomly told. So this is actually a photograph, which I have in my office. You probably can't see it, but it's actually one of the photos I have in my office, is by Angolan artist Quiluange Kiakenda, who is also the author of the anti-slavery memorial sculpture, which is very recently going to be, for the first time, created in the center of Lisbon, and resulted from a participatory process involving civil society. And this is a photograph. This photograph for me is very symbolic because it has about 10 years old, where there was no debate whatsoever about all these questions. And Quiluange back then created this performance, which he then photographed, which still to this day causes a great perplexity in many people. As I said, I have it in a copy of it in my office, and someone once asked me, why did I have a photo of the Padrão with having works with repairmen, let's say. So, you know, it's really a photograph that is very symbolic and very telling of the problems we still have in owning up to this colonial past. So what we are doing is, from the Padrão, you cannot see it from the photograph, but inside, you can go inside this monument, and you can almost be, in fact, under the water. And there's an auditorium, and you can do many activities there. So it is precisely from there that we have launched a series of initiatives, exhibitions such as racism and citizenship, which we have been, we had for 6 months, with all sorts of debates and conferences associated, and also the exhibition Red Atlantic, which is related to the blood of slaves that were forced to go from Africa to, for instance, Brazil in the Portuguese case, and by Brazilian artist Rosana Paulo. So what we have decided to do here, and it's been interesting because what you're seeing is basically a tourist monument. And I can tell when I go there, tourists are often very surprised when they arrive in this monument and they're sort of faced with this whole exhibition about racism or slavery. It's not what they're expecting. But for the locals, it's been very pedagogic. It's been very educative. And, you know, only 5 years ago, children were going to the Padrão and only hearing about the great discoveries the Portuguese did in the world. And now it's a whole different story. So it's something that has worked quite successfully and that we very much intend to continue just because of its symbolism. It's not at all the best place to have the conferences or to show the movies that we do. But from a symbolic point of view, it's very important, and we have been doing it regularly. If I can move on to the next slide, this is you can go on exactly. This is the Red Atlantic image of the exhibition, Red Atlantic, as I mentioned, of Brazilian artists. We can continue with the slides. Another thing we did was, yes, as it says, we dedicated an art gallery. We run 5 municipal art galleries, which are open to the public. And we, how can I say this? We announced, we didn't just do it, we announced we were going to dedicate this art gallery to post-colonialism, which is a big word that for some people doesn't mean much. And we take it in a very broad sense. So we don't just have African artists or African origin artists. We work with South America a lot. We are not just concerned with the relationship between Portugal and its former colonies. It's in a much broader sense, but still we have, it's probably a little bit outdated now, even though only 5 years have passed. But at the time when we did this, politically, it was a very important statement. At least it got people curious about this expression, post-colonialism, which many hadn't even heard about. And the image I chose to illustrate is Grada Quilomba. Grada has been living in Berlin for many years now, although she's Portuguese, of São Tomé origin. And her case is interesting because here is a Portuguese artist who has been, her career has been around these topics for probably 15 or 20 years now. And she was never recognized in Portugal until she was recognized in Brazil, in the São Paulo Bienal, and until she was recognized in Germany. And so it's been this reverse relationship, but still we were very proud to host the first individual exhibition by Grada Quilomba, who is also a writer and a psychologist. And her work alone, and which is very much about slavery in the historical perspective, but also in a very conceptual, contemporary conception as well, namely the way we use language. This exhibition was called The Most Beautiful Language, and also the way in the art world, particularly in this kind of gallery ecosystem, the way that curators and artists are represented. And so I'm happy to say that since we did this exhibition 3 years ago, her work became very much an influence, not just in Lisbon, but in Portugal, and has led to many other debates around this issue, and which I believe is not just an issue in Lisbon. I believe in other cities as well. It's more related probably to social and economic dynamics. This particular part of the art world tends to be very Caucasian dominated. And so that's something she has been dealing with. If I can have the next slide. Yes, so here I was looking or listening carefully to Naomi's presentation, and we've also had moments where we associate holidays of other communities and countries. So the Indian community or the Chinese community will organize holidays to which the city associates itself. What we tried to do here was different. It was to bring artists from these different communities to the key stages and to the official feasts of the city. In this case, this particular group is a very important and interesting one and representative of Lisbon. They're called Buraka Sound System. They reinterpreted African music sounds that existed in a very underground Lisbon music scene, which really just mixes all sorts of influences of countries and music sounds. And again, they became very popular in the United States, in places like Coachella, the big festivals. And here, they were always seen as foreign, even though they are all, if not Lisbon-born, very, very, having come here very early. So the idea here, or the practice in the past, was to have these musicians in these kind of urban festivals, usually on the outskirts or in parallel festivals. And the symbolism here was to bring them, and you can't see it in this photograph, but they're next to the other big colonial monument, which is the Torre de Belém, the Tower of Belém, which is again a fortress that was built during the Portuguese Empire, and which is very much, again, associated to this idea of discoveries. And so, again, very symbolically, this is where we chose to, in this case, to close the Feasts of Lisbon. So the most official feasts of Lisbon, which are related to a holiday of the patron saint of the city in June every year, except this year because of the public health situation. And we invited this very multi-ethnic origined group to close the city feasts, and this again had an impact beyond, I think, what we thought. In fact, we thought people wouldn't really notice we were doing this, but many did, and many artists did. So this has been very well received, and we've continued doing it. I'm not going to go on much further, just to going back to that idea of how difficult it is. And I was very curious as well, and I would love to know more about the instruments and tools that Glasgow, for instance, has already developed. Because what we are finding difficult here is to do this in an organized, systematic form. There are national plans, and Lisbon itself has anti-racism plans. But again, because of, for instance, the limitation of not being able to use data based on ethnicity, it's very difficult to know whether we are actually conducting change, at least as far as the representation of institutions is concerned. I can tell you empirically that it is absolutely overwhelming to see that there is no diversity whatsoever in our museums, in our theaters, and as far as EGEAC is concerned, I can tell you that out of 400 people, perhaps only 2 are not Caucasian. And we have been, in the last year or 2, particularly working on internally with human resources on the idea of making this, which is the organization, the cultural organization of the city, making it much more representative and mirror-like of the city it actually represents. And it's very difficult because we are not allowed to hire on this basis, or we are not allowed to introduce criteria that in the hiring process. So this is something I would be very interested to understand how cities, and perhaps Glasgow is not the best example here, but I know in France, for instance, the system is similar to here, how cities are going around these kind of legal national limitations. And just to say again that to reinforce the importance that movements such as Black Lives Matter have had in a city like Lisbon, for instance, to help us get this debate and these measures going even further. So it's been very important, even though these are things happening on the other side of the world. It's definitely been felt here and been a catalyst for many of the things of the change we're trying to break through. And just one last detail, which may at first hand not seem to have anything to do with racism, but in fact we found this to be the kind of issues that we sometimes overlook and how important, in fact, they are, which is, for example, the issues of public transportation and schedules. We were struck a few years back when we had this festival full of African origin artists and how the public was so not representative of that. And then we realized that, in fact, the fact that many of these initiatives were plays and concerts were closing after once public transportation was no longer available had a very big impact in the fact of some people not coming. So this is something we're also paying attention to very much, and it's something that is usually not very much part of the debate, but it's something which can have a very practical, immediate result. So again, I think I don't have any slide left, maybe just a thank you, but thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think that is a really helpful insight into the work underway in Lisbon and the crossovers between your work. And I think the efforts that we're making in Glasgow are very clear, and I'm sure colleagues across Europe will have similar experiences. I think the issues that you raise around challenging our histories and changing the narrative, I think, are so crucial to the discussion that we want to have this afternoon. So we're now moving into the time for questions and for interactions. And so if you do want to ask a question, please use the hand raising function, or you can also put questions into the chat box. While you're thinking of your question, what I would like to do is maybe ask Naomi to maybe answer the point that Joanne made towards the end about about the tools that we have at our disposal in Glasgow. And then once you've finished, Naomi, hopefully Graham Campbell has been able to join us. And Graham, if you're here, I was going to ask if you could maybe come in with any ideas that you would have in terms of the issues that were raised towards the end about how we make decisions based on the data that we are able to access in Glasgow, and we have that benefit, I suppose, of having good data to make decisions on, and then we can maybe open it up to other colleagues who are facing those similar challenges. So Naomi, and then we'll take Graham.
So the way we are able to use data is within the organisation. We can do staff surveys. It's all optional. But we can ask people's what you say in Britain is protected characteristics, so elements of their identity. Obviously, the census does that on a national level, and then that data is processed and publicly available. But I think Joanna's right in terms of we aren't best placed maybe to have that conversation or add a meaningful contribution to it, because we actually are in a privileged place to be able to ask the question and collect the data in the first place. So obviously that's really helpful for jobs like these, and we can kind of make the case for kind of very specific interventions or resources based on that data. But it sounds like it's we're in quite a unique position from the wider discussions we've had with the Eurocities, that lack of data, or I mean the genius of white supremacy stating that to ask is racist. I mean, that is just genius as a way to block the conversation even happening, even beginning. So that's really interesting, but I don't think we're best placed to maybe kind of speak to that. But I'm sure there's other people in this forum who can speak to that brilliantly. So I will hand over on that one and pass back to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Naomi. Graham, if you're able to join us, then that would be helpful. I'll give you a moment to get your microphone working.
I'm here.
Perfect. On you go.
Okay, well, that's given us so much food for thought. But I suppose it's one thing to have the ability to collect the data, which we do have in the UK and indeed in Glasgow. The next thing is, what do we do with the information? Because there's so much documentary research, which just in my lifetime that I've seen over the years, from the Scarman report into the Brixton riots to the Lawrence inquiry in 1999, which set up the race equality laws that we now have had for the last 21 years. And yet still we have public bodies still failing to properly collect data that we can meaningfully use and then to act on that data. So really it's about implementation. If there's one thing we going to listen to from the demonstrations we had 6 months ago all over the world after the death of George Floyd, it is that platitudinous attitudes to this subject are no longer permissible. Black people and people who are racially discriminated against institutionally are no longer prepared to accept platitudes. They want actions and results. They want not just the equality of opportunity and possibility, they want equality of outcome. And it's really about how the outcomes will be changed. Now, I make this point that learning about the slavery legacy and the colonial legacy is not only important just morally, politically, and therefore as an explanation for what's going on now, but you actually need to address that subject in order to name the problem you've got with racism now. You can't avoid, as you say, if you analyze that white supremacy is a thing, and there's a lot of cultural and political invested energy going on, particularly down south, to deny the culturality of white supremacy. We've even had a black government minister who's responsible for equality telling you that it's illegal to tell people in schools that critical race theories are a reality. You know, if we got people doing that denialism that Naomi just mentioned is quite possible here. It's quite possible for all the progress we've made 20 years ago and since to be reversed. So we're not playing here. We intend to implement what we say. We intend to use the data we have and then act upon that data and change policies, therefore change outcomes for people. It is no longer acceptable in Glasgow as a city with 15% of the adult population and 20% of the school population being from a Black or Asian or minority ethnic background for us to not, if you walk into an all-white room in this city, it should not be happening. It should not be possible. And if it does happen, and it does happen frequently to myself, it's happening because there is a discrimination going on. And if we understand racism that way, we then have to work out what is it that we do that creates those white-only spaces, because actions have occurred to make that happen. So let us look at our actions, our institutions, our processes. This is not new stuff. These words I'm using are from the Lawrence report and from the laws that we've had since. It's Macpherson's word. It's a big old white judge's words. He saw that 21 years ago, and yet we're still struggling with it. So what are we going to do differently? The legacy is good if we're acknowledging it because it allows us to tell the stories. We have a city full of evidence of that slavery connection. We have institutions which have arisen from those connections, whether it's the Trades House, whether it's the Lord Provosts, the city chambers, it's our whole existence. Our universities have done very well, particularly Glasgow, in acknowledging it. And I think it's a tribute to them that they've been made University of the Year this year as a result of their reparative justice work. And that's important. That difficult journey we began 5 years ago allowed us to open up this discussion with the Black community in Glasgow around how do we acknowledge that legacy, look for the evidence, the objective evidence. So we've done that. The historian Stephen Mullen did that for us, and we're doing the same for the city now. We're following suit. Buildings have been renamed, are being studied, study centres have been established, reparative justice actions have begun in terms of acknowledging that legacy between Scotland and the Caribbean. We've started that process and we've made some major strides, and we've allowed people to talk about racism and where it comes from. So by facilitating those discussions, we're beginning to heal that problem. But we're only beginning. And let's not kid ourselves. Culture is an important weapon in the fight to begin this healing. And the one thing that I can say for Glasgow, that we've become an international centre for the study of this legacy, and that is attracting people from all over the planet to come here, particularly people from the rest of the UK to come here, to look at our legacy, to look at the way we're trying to acknowledge it. And that's a good thing. We're learning from Liverpool, we're learning from Washington, DC, we're learning from Atlanta, and museums all over the world are also addressing this legacy. And we're sharing knowledge, we're sharing stories and authorities. We have archives which are contributing to that global discussion about this legacy. That allows us a lot of possibilities to exchange, to interact, and we've got an important journey to tell with our European brothers and sisters, because we have legacies in common. I'm so glad to see Lisbon's efforts that are definitely along the same lines as ours. And it's delightful to see that. And it's a connection we're going to carry on making. And I'm sure that there are European brothers and sisters in this conversation who are definitely along the same lines as we are. We're doing our bit. We're using our resources. These resources are here. It's best to use them. They have a difficult origin. We can use them to tell a different story about how our citizens want to tell their story now. And it's not by forgetting, it's by organised remembering, but a reconditioning of how we use these cultural resources.
Okay, Graham, thank you very much. I think as people will be able to experience, we all got to see you on video earlier. I know you had maybe some technical issues joining us at the start of the meeting, so we got to see your video, but people will be able to see for themselves that you have been a veteran campaigner on many of these issues for many decades, and I'm sure is always happy to share his personal and political experiences, and is always available for an online discussion whenever people may want it. But next I've got Thomas, please, from Leipzig.
Yeah, David, hello from Leipzig. It's really good to hear from the reports from the activities in Glasgow and in Lisboa. And I don't have a question. I would just like to share very brief remarks on the situation in Leipzig. In Leipzig, we have just begun to work on our colonial past, and the City Council has begun this year to discuss street names, which maybe should be changed. But we have a long tradition also of anti-racist practice. We have our intercultural weeks every year. We have many political programs to fight racism. And one of the things that I found very helpful is that when we received very many refugees in the years 2015, 2016, and 17, some of our cultural institutions like a theater and a musical institution started to develop programs where our professional players developed theater plays together with refugees, and these were very, very interesting and very enlightening programs. And one final remark, I think now during the Corona pandemic, we all realize how important culture is. It's not just an asset in our free time, but it is one of the bases of a democratic society. It helps us to reflect on our daily lives, but also on the situation of our society that we live in. So, David, thank you very much for this event. It was very good.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks for your contribution. I think it's an interesting point about how culture does reflect the society, because I know that you're a big fan of music, for example, and Glasgow music in particular. But I think even within the city, we maybe don't truly reflect contemporary Glasgow through our own music scene. And I think that is something that we want to be aware of in changing and ensuring that, again, we're not falling into our old traps of history of just assuming that all of our culture is white. So let's make sure that we're sharing those lessons. Some of the questions that Naomi posed towards the end of her presentation were about what the approaches that other cities had taken to anti-racist practice. So I wanted to see if anyone wanted to share those. Because I'm not seeing any hands. I don't know if it's just my screen or if you're all being very shy and not wanting to ask lots of questions, but it's quite an unusual approach. There is some discussion in the chat more around data collection, and we can try and maybe get some of the answers to those. Yes, so I've got Charlotte, I think.
Hi, yes, I'm from Cardiff Council.
Hi, perfect, thank you.
Hi, so we have just launched our Race Equality Task Force, which is one of our big priorities as part of our strategic equality plan for 2020 to 2024. That's one of our biggest things at the moment. It is brand new. We've only met once, but the work streams have been confirmed as employment and representation within the council workforce, education and youth service provision, as well as a civic voice, so citizens' voice, because we've got the census coming up, and that is hugely important for us. And the way that our task force is working, that'll be a huge one to make sure that the voices of our communities are counted accurately. And then at the moment we are in conversations with crime commissioners to make sure that we've got a crime and justice work stream, and then a health work stream as well, due to obviously the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on Black and minority communities. It is something that we are incredibly passionate about. We've also had the Welsh Government audit that has been the first phase of the audit that came through a couple of weeks ago, looking at slave trade and British colonial connections within our communities, and that's come from anything to buildings, building names, statues, street names, similar to what Thomas was mentioning. We are at the beginning of that stage, but hoping to take a really big leap forward, and because I mean Cardiff is pretty unique in its multicultural nature and history, and we want to make sure that all voices are heard. So that's where we're at the moment.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing that with us. I think what would be helpful, if I maybe bring Naomi back in. Naomi, you can maybe touch on some of the work that Miles is going to be undertaking as our new curator on some of these issues, and once you've had that opportunity, I'll then maybe bring Annette Christie in, if Annette is here, who can talk about Glasgow's own task force, which sounds quite similar to that we've just heard from our colleagues in Wales. So Naomi, please.
Yes, of course. Lovely to hear that, Charlotte. Brilliant to hear what Wales is doing. I was just talking to probably one of your colleagues about the festival 2022 applications and Cardiff being a part of that. So we have recently appointed, Glasgow Life Museum Service has recently appointed a new curator of the legacies of empire and slavery. And so it's a specific role, a bit similar to my role, in that it's joint post between National Museums and Galleries Scotland and Glasgow Life Museum Service. And it's to look at the way we interpret our collections, tell our narrative around how Glasgow was involved in the slave trade, to look at the kind of Scottish specificity, as well as consult communities around their involvement in how we tell the stories. So actually it's quite a collaborative post. And that's been filled by Miles Greenwood, who I think Graham's probably met by now, if not once, many times. And so that's really exciting, because we've got a bit of a kind of cultural tandem process wherein my role and Graham and David, we're looking at the kind of contemporary aspects of white supremacy and racism and white privilege within Glasgow Life, not the organisation, as in the life of the city. And we have a team of people looking at how that's connected to the historical legacy. Because if you don't know where you come from, you can't place yourself. If we don't understand our historical context, how we got here, why things are the way they are, we can't move forward in an informed way. And so that feeds back to what Charlotte's saying about how kind of garbled the reporting on COVID disproportionately affecting Black communities was. It was about diabetes, it was about that, it was about anything except institutionalised racism. And race is a healthcare issue, as you know. So that's really great to hear the work that's happening in Wales, and that's how we're kind of approaching it in quite a joined up effect in terms of the linear line of history to our contemporary time now, but also looking at all those different aspects like education, employment, culture and arts, healthcare. Yeah, so I don't know if that answers the question, but it's such a sprawling subject. I'll hand back to you.
Perfect, thanks, Naomi. Again, all of these subjects are areas where if people want more information, I'm sure they'll be able to contact Naomi or myself through our Eurocities colleagues. Annette, hopefully you're able to come in next. So Annette will be familiar to those of you who are on the Social Affairs Forum, as she's your recently elected new Vice Chair of Social Affairs, and Annette chairs the Glasgow City Council task force that's looking into a number of issues around race equality in the city. So Annette, you can maybe say a little bit about the work that you're doing and how it's similar to the process in Cardiff that we've heard about.
Yeah, thank you, David. And it is a pleasure this afternoon just to be listening to this conversation and sharing ideas of what's been happening in all our cities. So yes, as David has said, I chair the Black Minority Ethnic Task Group in Glasgow City Council. That's been ongoing now for quite a few months, coming up for a year. But during COVID, this group feeds into our social recovery task force in the council. So everything that affects our Black and minority ethnic communities is being reflected now in our wider discussions and our social recovery from COVID-19, or hopefully we'll be out of it very soon with the first vaccinations just taking place last week. So within this BME group that I chair, there's 4 main areas that we've identified as priorities for us to focus on. And so we're developing work streams throughout that, and subgroups have come out of that. So they are employment, and as has been said already, the lack of representation Black or BME people in, well, the higher echelons of any organisation really within Glasgow or the country in general, but just overly represented in the lowest paying professions. Also digitalisation and the digital divide. And again, we've seen COVID, anyone in the most deprived areas being affected most by the digital divide and not being able to communicate as well as others may have been. And unfortunately, those in the BME communities live in a lot of those deprived areas. Data, we're looking at data, so we've already heard of all the information that is available, but where there's gaps, we need to dig into that a bit further to make sure that feeds into everything that we're doing. And the last thing, again, has been mentioned throughout this discussion, education. So education at all levels, but obviously we're focused very much on our young people in our primary and secondary schools. And what has been and still is the history, not teaching of the history of where people come from. And that's not just simply about the BME communities, it's actually about Scots in general. Lack of historical teaching of our country and where we are now and where we came from. So, and where the newcomers to our country, but BME people fit into that, because obviously they're not new. That we do have new immigrants, but they're not all new. Many have been here for centuries. So where do they fit into that education? And as the mother of a mixed race child myself, it's something that I take a very keen interest in and watch very closely. And she's 17 years old, and up until this year, she had never, well, as far as she was aware, she had never experienced racism. It obviously is all around us. We all know there's systemic and structural racism within our society, but she had never seen it herself. And it's only this year during the pandemic, when she got a little job to keep her busy when school was out, she became a key worker. And it was at that point, interacting with the public, she actually saw racism. So I work very closely, obviously, with Councillor David MacDonald, the deputy leader for Glasgow, and also with Naomi. We're building up a working relationship now, and with Graham as well. Emancipation Acts that was mentioned earlier in the video, that was Graham's bag, Graham and other colleagues, but I did some supporting work within that, helping the community get involved during that event in 2014. So working in the community, bringing the newcomers, many of them refugees, are still going through the asylum system, and they were heavily involved in that project, and that was wonderful to see. And my daughter also was a wee dancer in one of the background shots in the Merchant City. So that's just a wee update from what I'm doing as chair of the group, but I think it's very much in line with what everyone is saying here. The key thing for me going forward apart from supporting people, is education and allowing everyone the space to speak, and Black people make sure their voices are heard. I'm here to amplify their voice, but I also want to make it comfortable for others to be able to open up and address any concerns that they have and not be afraid to speak out or ask questions.
Great, thank you very much, Annette. I think that final point about people feeling comfortable to ask questions is important, because I think it is just through that dialogue and discussion and better understanding that we're able to challenge some of the more negative aspects that still exist within our society. And it's good to see people are sharing information in the chat around some of the acronyms that we use, perhaps again too easily in English, which don't always translate into the Euro English that we're all trying to speak today. And it's very hard for Scottish people to speak Euro English, perhaps more difficult than our colleagues from elsewhere on the continent. But hopefully we've got through today without too many Scottish words creeping into the conversation. But we do have a wee amount of time left to just reflect on some of what we've heard today. We've got a few minutes left. People have put hands up and then take them back down. Apologies if people have wanted to ask questions. Time has kind of caught up with us slightly, but we're very keen that we keep this discussion and dialogue going. And our final part of today is just around what the next steps might be. Some of those next steps are ones that Glasgow would like to take very quickly, but we want to do so in partnership with all of you and with Eurocities. In particular, I think the fact that we've been able to unite the Culture and the Social Affairs Forum here today is a positive, and hopefully we can work with both of those forums in taking forward some of the issues that we've addressed today. If you are interested in continuing this dialogue, then please either put your details in the chat. My apologies to our Eurocities colleagues. I think I was supposed to introduce Slido at some point today, where people could have put their names and details in if they wanted to continue these conversations. But I think you can, hopefully, it's happening as I speak. So there you go. If you do want to continue this conversation, please put your city name and details and contacts into the Slido, and we can make sure that you are part of the conversation going forward. We very much want to take an approach in Glasgow where we are embedding anti-racist practice into all of our works, but culture in particular is a key area for us to start that focus on. Another area that I think we would like to develop some discussion around is the links between anti-racist practice and social justice, and in particular climate justice. So next year, some of you may know that Glasgow is hosting COP26, the UN Climate Conference. We have been very clear that we want cities to have a voice at that COP like never before, because ending climate change begins in cities. But in particular, the cities of the global south need to be properly represented like never before. And in Glasgow, we want to build a bridge between Santiago, who were the hosts of COP25, and the next hosts of COP27, who will be an African city, yet to be decided. But I think there is a very clear need for us to understand our position of privilege as European cities when we have discussions around climate and the impact that our use of carbon has in the cities of the global south. And perhaps we want to have a discussion around climate reparations that we can make as European cities. And we should always say that reparations don't always have to be about cash or money. It can be about building capacity. It can be about sharing practice and expertise. And that's some of the work that Graham Campbell mentioned that Glasgow University have started recently, where they are working with the University of the West Indies to help build capacity and to offer scholarships to students. So Those are two areas I think that we would like to focus on in Glasgow, but I think it's quite clear from the conversation that we've had today that there's a number of other areas around how we use data in our decision making, and what are the impacts that has around race, and also how we collectively start to address those issues around colonialism, of empire, of imperialism, and how that will impact our streetscape and our cityscapes going forward in a contemporary way. So I think there is a lot of discussion and dialogue that can continue, and Glasgow would be very pleased and proud to offer a platform for that discussion to happen. So we will collect all of the information that's going into the chat now for people who want to stay in touch. But if you think of something after today's meeting, then please contact our Eurocities colleagues, Katerina or Julie, and they can put you in touch with Glasgow directly. So I think we're now 1 minute over our allotted time slot. So I just wanted to finally say a huge thank you to all of you for your attendance, for your participation, and for your willingness to take part in this dialogue. We all have to continue to work together to take collective action to ensure that we are always challenging the racism that exists within our society. And if we can in any way help with the work that you are undertaking in your city in Glasgow, then please do get in touch. So I hope you all have a very enjoyable festive period and a very safe and healthy new year. And we hope very much to see you in Glasgow in person in the future, perhaps for COP26, but certainly for our future Eurocities events. So thank you very much, colleagues, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.